The environmentalist movement of the 1960s was the most influential period of environmental legislative production ever. The evolution of the idea of wilderness during this era, an idea that ultimately grew to shape the movement it was a product of, defined the opinions of a generation. The environmentalist movement would be forever changed, and the unprecedented events of the 1960s environmentalist movement will be cemented as a turning point in Western history. Wilderness in the 1960s initiated the 20th century environmentalist movement and sparked the greatest period of environmental legislative production ever. The importance of this movement was largely derived from the newfound ideas and perspectives on wilderness discussed during this era. These ideas radically challenged the course of the environmentalist movement and provoked a widespread public outcry to save this aspect of our natural world. Environmentalists in the 1960s introduced the idea that nature has an intrinsic, unquantifiable value that must be preserved to prevent irreversible losses to the human psyche. They argued that its preservation is essential to our existence as a society, and we must act immediately to ensure its preservation. Through the discussion of this idea, a vicious critique of anthropocentrism and capitalism through a newly developed ecocentric philosophy took the movement by storm. The spread of this ecocentric philosophy resulted in a reevaluation of the relationship between humanity and the environment. Environmentalists further believed that humans could coexist in perfect harmony with nature, using the wilderness as an example of the final frontier within which this harmony still exists in our modern world. There were several key moments that defined the environmentalist movement in the 1960s. The publication of 3 texts, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Wallace Stegner's Wilderness Letter, and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, created the ideal social climate for mass legislative changes. These legislative changes included the passing of the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. This legislation took unparalleled inspiration from the critical texts published during the 1960s, as evidenced by the final wording of these pieces of legislation, which in some cases directly lifted from the text that I described above. Wallace Stegner's Wilderness Letter in particular had a profound impact on these pieces of legislation. Stegner's Wilderness Letter was essentially an argument for the value of wilderness. It pushed back against traditional definitions of wilderness by arguing that its existence has intrinsic, unquantifiable value. It serves as a symbol of hope that nature will climb back from its rapid deterioration at the hands of humanity. Furthermore, nature holds its value regardless of its usage. Its existence alone, even in an untouched state, serves as a mental respite from the monotony of everyday life, promising that someday we may experience nature in its unabridged state. Stegner's literary style was visceral and emotional, thus increasing his piece's public appeal and causing the text to circulate widely throughout the general public. Stegner further used his distinctive literary style to convey his evaluation of the destructiveness of Western anthropocentrism through the perspective of wilderness. Through this critique, Stegner also sowed the initial seeds of climate pessimism, which were further promoted by literary works that followed. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring offered a similar reevaluation of Western anthropocentrism to that of Stegner through a publication of a radical text viciously critiquing the pesticide industry while simultaneously calling out government collusion. This absolute bombshell of a publication, published within the perfect political climate for inspiring rapid political change, completely altered the face of the 1960s environmentalist movement. Throughout the text, Carson warned of the imminent consequences of pesticide usage and discussed the limitations of technological progression for negating these consequences. Carson also shed light on the collusion between the US government and the pesticide industry, thus demonstrating that the government was not acting in the best interest of the environmentalist movement or the American general public. This text was written to maximize readability in order to appeal to the general public. Upon publication, the text immediately generated widespread societal upheaval as the text fueled the flames of a social climate that was left in an unstable state in the wake of the Cold War. Tragically, Carson died only months after the book's publication. It was later unveiled that she was working on the book while she was battling cancer, which ended up ultimately taking her life just after she published her seminal work. Once this information got out to the general public, it turned Carson into a martyr-like figure in the eyes of the general public, and it only skyrocketed the popularity of her ideas. The Population Bomb was published towards the end of the 1960s and drew upon the ideas presented by Stegner and Carson. The title is quite a misnomer, as population is not the primary focus of the text. Ehrlich wanted the name to be Population, Resources, and Environment, but publishers were not supportive of this, and instead, they went with something much more captivating. The Population Bomb dedicates a significant portion of the text to addressing the imminent threat that population growth will have on wilderness. Ehrlich even goes as far as directly quoting Stegner in this text, which evidences the immense influence of Stegner's ideas on Ehrlich. Ehrlich also leveraged radical political theory, which directly appealed to the political climate that had been shaken to its core by previous environmentalist publications like Silent Spring. The text was perfectly crafted by Ehrlich to take advantage of the social climate of the 1960s, and as a result, the text had an immense influence on the environmentalist movement's success within this era. Additionally, Ehrlich truly doubled down on the climate pessimism introduced by Carson and Stegner. On just the first page of the text, Ehrlich states that nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Furthermore, Ehrlich also attacked anthropocentrism and argued that it was a key factor in the downfall of our climate and subsequent increase in the world death rate. The three seminal texts of the 1960s environmentalist movement all had several commonalities which became essential principles of the environmentalist movement and our society's view of the value of wilderness. Each text placed an explicit emphasis on the intrinsic, unquantifiable value of wilderness. They each also argued that its loss would cause irreversible damages to the human psyche. They each also exploited a social climate ripe for radical change to convey newfound environmental principles. We can also clearly delineate a rise in climate pessimism within each of the texts. Through this pessimistic lens, each text challenged traditional Western anthropocentrism through the presentation of an ecological critique of capitalism. The legislative results of the publication of these texts and subsequent public outcry were swift and immense. The concentration and severity of legislation passed during this era are unparalleled throughout the history of the environmentalist movement. Additionally, the legislation took clear inspiration from redefinitions and ideas of wilderness presented within these seminal texts. For example, within the Wilderness Act, we can see the influence of Stegner's Wilderness Letter within the emotional language that was used in the final legislation. Ultimately, at the end of the decade, all the environmentalist efforts of the 1960s culminated in the birth of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first celebration of Earth Day. The social effects of texts addressing wilderness in the 1960s essentially revolved around a complete reevaluation of the relationship between humanity and the natural world. We witnessed a rapid rise of ecocentrism and a demonization of anthropocentrism. Additionally, the ecological critique of capitalism sowed deep seeds of doubt in the current political system within the social consciousness. The spread of these ideas sparked widespread environmental activism for wilderness preservation, which took shape through protests, grassroots lobbying, and individual action. We could draw a direct comparison between the environmentalist movement in the 1960s and the modern environmentalist movement. The modern social climate is much akin to that of the 1960s. COVID-19 and the recent heightened concentration and intensity of natural disasters has created an unstable social climate that could potentially be exploited to support the environmentalist movement in a similar way to that of the 1960s environmentalists. The ecological critique of capitalism first presented in the 1960s also continually gained traction into the 21st century and is still deeply infused within the modern social consciousness and is currently at the forefront of modern climate reform efforts. The rise of this critique also went hand in hand with growing climate pessimism across the board. We can learn a considerable amount from the actions of environmentalists during the 1960s. we learned about the power of wilderness and its ability to spark nationwide action. The value of specific social climates for inciting rapid change also cannot be understated, as evidenced by its importance in inciting the widespread protests that occurred during the 1960s. Additionally, the power of ideas and redefinitions was put on full display, as Stegner's redefinition of wilderness radically altered the course of the environmentalist movement forever. Additionally, we learned that environmental and social issues are closely intertwined, as evidenced by the clear divide between egocentrism and anthropocentrism, and how it influenced the environmentalist movement. Finally, we uncovered that large corporations, especially in capitalist nations, must be held under intense scrutiny for climate efforts to be successful.